15, so we'll go ahead and get started. I'm really happy to be able to introduce Eriol today. Eriol is a human rights-centered designer who has more than 10 years of experience in for-profit companies, nonprofit companies, and open source software organizations, focusing on solving the complex problems of the world. In their talk, UX Research and Ethnographic Design for Humanitarian Technology, they'll share how to structure UX field research in marginalized communities and how to work with traumatic subject matter as a researcher and designer. Please note, this talk will cover sensitive topics like genocide, democracy, gender-based violence, and difficult circumstances such as informal settlements and areas where radicalization is high. If anyone has any questions, please put them in the Q&A tab and we'll get to answering those at the end of the session. Also, feel free to use the chat to communicate with us and the other attendees. I'll be keeping an eye on that and sharing anything with Eriol at the end. So with that, I'll hand it over to you, Eriol. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, so hello, welcome to this talk about doing user experience research and ethnographic design for humanitarian technology. The two projects that I reference most heavily in pieces during this talk are in the areas of peace building and peace education and crisis response. Crisis response in terms of both disaster response, which are what we typically kind of call natural disasters like hurricanes and typhoons and things like that, but also some references to non-natural disasters or human-made disasters as well. There's going to be some specific stories and some general tips towards the end and advice for undertaking user experience research or field work in a country or community that isn't the one of your own origin or your own residence, or you've not done work internationally before with these kinds of communities. You'll find a link on screen at the moment. It's a bit.ly link to these slides with annotations. So it's bit.ly/ef-hum-ux-yol. So just to cover the content warnings again, some of the difficult topics that come up in this talk are around violence against women specifically, Rwandan genocide, the Manchester arena bombing here in the UK, radicalisation of youth and terrorism, natural and human-made disasters and crises, colonialisation, racism, educational and social status prejudice, and some food-related trauma. I know that that's quite a lot and quite a heavy list. They don't go into great depth with a lot of them, but it's always good to know what to expect and do what you need to do to feel safe and comfortable as we explore these topics. Don't feel like you have to sit through these topics if you find them particularly difficult right now. Some slides will have no photos or copies, please. Please do not take screenshots or copies of these slides. People have given their consent to be in the slides, but not to be distributed outside of the content of this talk. Just a little bit more about me before we get into the really interesting stuff. I'm Eriol, and my pronouns are they, them. I have been doing design for about 11 years now. I always forget to add the years as they go by. And that's in both the for-profit kind of commercial proprietary software sector, as well as moving more into the humanitarian NGO and non-profit sector. I have done work in the humanitarian and non-profit sector and also volunteered within that sector. So it's a mixture of paid work and volunteering as well. And I've been involved in open source software for a little bit less time, and that's about 4 years. I also took on a PhD this year because I'm not busy enough. So I am now a PhD doctoral trainee. I'm looking at how designers contribute to open source humanitarian and human rights software at Newcastle University's Open Lab. So if you're curious about those kinds of things, what I'm researching there and that topic, you can always ask after the talk or on Twitter. And what I like to call myself is a human rights centered designer. And that's an interesting topic again, which we can go into if we have time. But there is a difference between humanitarian and human rights to some extent. And the definition of human rights centered designer extends into the ways in which designing for humans might include the things that those humans aren't aware of, i.e. their human rights, which actually a lot of people around the world aren't very aware of their rights that they have access to when when engaging with software, when engaging with services. So that's the brief definition of a human rights-centered designer. The content of this talk is from when I worked as a lead designer at Ushahidi. Ushahidi is an amazing, fantastic organization that is Kenyan-based and Kenyan-grown. It's an NGO, and it makes and maintains open source software for humanitarian cases and human rights needs. Ushahidi was founded in 2007 and 2008 during the first democratic elections in Kenya, when there was a lot of unrest, civil unrest, and a lot of challenges with the democratic process there. The original founders found that of the many things that were happening among the citizens, among the population, around their rights to exercise democracy, one thing that wasn't really being served was people telling their own stories. And so Ushahidi was created and is a service primarily for citizens and populations and humans to report on things that are happening around them. Ushahidi means raise your voice or testimony in Swahili. It on screen at the moment is an example of how Ushahidi has been used past the original democratic uses back in 2007 and 2008. So the example on the screen is when Ushahidi's core platform tool was used to map crisis response for the Nepal earthquakes. And from that citizen-driven data, from those citizen-driven reports around what was happening as the earthquake was indeed happening and prior to the earthquake happening, it meant the aid in the form of helicopters from the Nepalese army could be deployed to where they were needed most. So this is a really great example of how engaging with citizens within their own crises can lead to better humanitarian aid and better humanitarian support. Ushahidi doesn't just make the one tool, it doesn't just do the one sort of thing. There is another tool on screen at the moment, which was a really interesting one if you want to investigate it, called 10-4. And that was created after the Westgate Mall attacks in Kenya, where there was a terrorist attack there. And we personally within Ushahidi were having trouble getting in contact with some of our own staff members. And we suspected that staff members or friends of staff members were at the Westgate Mall when that attack was happening, and we just couldn't get in contact with them. You might be familiar with the sort of experience of when you're trying to get in contact with a friend and you text them, and then maybe you use another service to try and message them, you call them, maybe you call their friend to try and find out, or one of your mutual friends to try and find out where they are. Imagine that, but in the context of you think your friend is in amongst a terrorist attack at the moment. So we created a tool which helps aggregate different communication methods for crisis scenarios called 10-4. So that's a brief overview of the kinds of things that Ushahidi gets involved in, and the kinds of services and the kinds of tools and the kinds of contexts that I was doing user experience design and research within, alongside one of my fantastic colleagues, Justin Shearer at Ushahidi. I now work at a different organization, but in the same space, Simply Secure. So Simply Secure is a design-specific nonprofit based in Berlin and New York City. Founded in 2014, we design and support responsible technology that enables human dignity. So we do design and strategy and lots of other things for open technology tools, privacy, security, decentralization, transparency, and human rights tools, and for nonprofits working in and around technology. So first off, around the context of doing this kind of user experience research in developing countries, let's talk about language and terminology. So you may have heard of terms like developing countries and the global south when engaging or being interested in humanitarian work. The names and labels for other places, quote unquote, are vast and often confusing. Just a sample of a few on screen at the moment. There really is no perfect language here. Lots of different organizations use lots of different terms when referring to the countries that they do work in, especially humanitarian work. But what I try and do is I will refer to specific countries that I work in, or I am trying to get my language closer towards a term, the underrepresented majority countries. If I do slip back into the global south or developing countries, apologies. The way that language transforms is often slow and takes a lot of practice. So to talk about the two projects briefly that I'm going to be referencing in terms of when we get into the advice and some of the things that we did for these projects, the first project that I'll reference is Izuku. Izuku means Fountain of Peace in Kinyarwanda, which is one of Rwanda's national languages. And Izuku was a EU, so European Union funded consortium project undertaken by universities, nonprofits and companies, so for-profit companies as well. And that's typically what a consortium means and is within this context. And the organizations that were involved with the work around Izuku are King's College London, the University of Makerere, an organization called Dotsoft, Leiden University in the Netherlands, the Aegis Trust, and the Kigali Collaborative Research Centre, alongside Ushahidi as the technology and design partner. So what did Izuku try and do, and what were Izuku's aims? So Izuku was created to explore the potential of digital technologies to support peace through testing and development in Rwanda and Kenya over the period of 3 years. I believe Izuku wrapped at the end of 2020, so it's been over for almost a year now. You can find out more information about Izuku and some of the different things that we did there and reports at a URL, izuku.eu. Izuku is spelled ISOOKO. The second project that I'm going to reference when I talk about what we did is around this topic is Dispatcher. So Dispatcher was a much shorter project. It was more of a MVP or minimum viable product focus for Ushahidi, and it was done over the course of 6 months with a short burst of funding. Dispatcher's aim was to discover whether technology can help people create and maintain resilience in times of crisis, and what kinds of technology helps and aids rather than overwhelms people during these periods of crisis. We were looking at community cohesion and how people globally help each other in response to a crisis. And this is linked to an idea of resilience in both an individual way and a group way. So how those two things interconnect, the personal resilience and how it relates to a group or a community. The work around Dispatcher is particularly interesting given that it was done just before our current pandemic climate, when we saw a lot of resilience activities happen once the people around the globe wanted to respond to the pandemic through the form of mutual aid groups. So when we talk about resilience, we can look at and investigate mutual aid as one of those ways that communities and individuals respond in a resilient way to crisis. So the first big thing is, why Rwanda and Kenya? So it might feel like a given to be doing humanitarian work in these places to some. So not to all, but to some, it might feel like, of course, you would do humanitarian investigation work into technology and peace and crisis in these locations. But it's really important to understand and explore why you're doing work in a specific location. So within the context of our two projects and our wider project work at Ushahidi, Rwanda's history with genocide led to a number of different social policies and projects that worked in and around peace and how peace grows within communities and is supported by technology. And Kenya's history of tribal and political conflict allowed exploration into crisis, among other ways that Kenya as a country and populations and people and communities within Kenya respond to different crises. But when you're looking at where to conduct your research, I would really recommend and ask you to ask yourself these questions. Why is this the country and or the city that I want to investigate this problem in? What can I learn from the community here that I might find more difficult in my country of residence, or different from my country of residence or country of comfort? And what unique problems am I committing to solve or begin to solve by researching here? So even if you're likely to conduct research within your own country of residence or community of origin or comfort, this I found is a really great practice to get into when you're beginning to do user experience research and beginning to do design research, is that just because you can research in a particular location doesn't mean it's the right place to be researching or the right approach to be researching. So always make sure that you're asking these questions and you're not just assuming that these are the best places to do humanitarian design research in. That being said, even though Rwanda and Kenya are legitimately the best places to be doing this kind of research and conducting these studies for these technology tools, grant funding often stipulates in the proposal phases, so before we apply for the money and before we receive the money, where research should happen in a lot of ways. This is changing for certain grants and certain funding, but in a lot of ways it's still before you begin to do the research is where kind of you get told essentially that this is where research should happen. And most humanitarian work is funded through grants or donations. So grants are quite restrictive in some ways. There's different kinds of grants as well, which I won't go into during this talk. Donations are perhaps a little less restrictive and a little bit more beholden to the people that you receive the donations from. So what this actually does, so this grant funding structure within the design research context, is what it often does is it restricts the opportunity to discover other locations where research could be done that is very, very useful for what you're trying to research, especially when we think of tools and technology as global tools and technology. That was something that was talked about in the keynote this morning, is that our tools and software often have a global application, or you should always be assuming that there is a global application. If there's internet access, there is access to your tools if they're online, or reasonable access to your tools. So sometimes doing further research needs further funding, or maybe you need another partner organization in the other location that you intend to do the research in, but it can be tricky. But what I would find myself doing a little bit sneakily, in an ethical, sneaky way, is doing research on multiple projects continuously as I visited places that had relevance. So when I was working on other projects, I did the kind of research for Izuku and Dispatcher when I was visiting places like Kazakhstan, Tunisia, and Romania for these other projects that I was working on. And another tricky thing with funded humanitarian work, as even design and technology funded humanitarian work, is when academia is involved. And I can say this as an academic to some extent myself now, is that the methodologies that you can use when you have academia involved can be restrictive for good reasons from an academic perspective, but really tricky reasons from a design practice perspective. So as practitioners, and I'm putting my practitioner hat on now and not my academic hat, we often use the methods and ways to engage with the people that we want to engage with and understand better and work with that gives us these pathways to potential results that we're interested in exploring. So we can flex, we can bend, we can change things when we need to be able to do that, as long as we document it well and we're doing it ethically. Whereas academia often within these contexts are testing the methodological relevancy within the context as well. So design academics and practitioners notably have quite different needs from the research that is done within these humanitarian contexts. This is something to keep in mind if and when you're doing this kind of work with these kinds of partners. So I've had many heated debate, very kind heated debate with academic partners about essential flexibility needed within methodologies in order to do right by the people that we're designing with and that we're providing technology alongside with. If you're curious about the methodology that we have been using and used, in Izuku, we used something called Living Labs, which we applied mostly to the work that we did with the public. And I'll go more into the people that we worked with next. But we used the Living Labs methodology. On screen at the moment is sort of a diagram with multiple different circles about how different methodologies are more like lab settings, or users as co-creators, and real life environments and users as a subject of study. So it positions Living Labs closer to real life environments and users as co-creators. So it sits quite closely, although people with more of an academia methodology background would probably argue with me on this, but it sits more closely to a participatory design approach where you involve stakeholders and users and all the different people that you would want to, that would be using things and advocating for tools in the process of creating those solutions as much as possible and as early as possible. It also sits very closely to open source, which is another love of mine. So I was quite happy to be investigating this methodology. In Dispatcher, the project for crisis resilience, we didn't have academia involved in that one. And we were therefore able to be a bit more flexible with how we approached our research and how we structured our research within the context of needing to report to our funders as well. So we needed to still gather essential information that our funders wanted to know. So, but we could still play around a little bit more with Dispatcher. So to go into what we did with Izuku specifically at the moment. So for the academic portion of the research, or to meet some of the academic needs of the work that we were doing with Izuku, we were required to do some activities. So even this list that's on the screen at the moment, which I'll read out, some of these activities were required as per the grant and as per this is what we're testing, whether these methods and these ways of doing things alongside the technology build work within this context. So we were testing out the tools and the methodology as well as the tools in terms of like the activities essentially that we're doing, as well as maybe the technology tools. But we actually decided to, after discussion, omit one activity from the public workshops, as well as adapt other activities to be more engaging and relevant to the public attendees. So for the public workshops, so for the public engagements, we did activities which will maybe sound familiar to some of you or most of you. We did user journeys, persona building, stakeholder mapping, and rapid prototyping. The activity that we omitted was a very fill out these questions on a form sort of exercise, and there's a good reason why we omitted that, which I'll go into in just a second. But the second group of people that we are engaging with were civil society organizations, or CSOs. So if I refer to CSOs again, civil societies. And these folks are academic institutions, maybe schools, maybe universities, other NGOs, maybe even local government. Civil society organizations can span a number of different kinds of organizations, but they were an integral stakeholder of peace, and they were doing lots of peace work as well as us with this grant-funded project. And therefore, we wanted to make sure that we included them within Izuku and the research that we were doing. However, from previous experience, a team member that was on the Izuku project flagged that CSOs would have very different needs and expectations than the general public. So we used this inherent inbuilt knowledge of the team working on this project to better structure the work that we were doing with CSOs. So what we identified was that we needed to offer the CSOs more value beyond the participation in workshops. So what we decided to include with CSOs was insight into how they do their own work with the communities that they work with, which just so happened to be a lot of the kinds of people that were in our public workshops. So with CSOs, we were really focused on sharing what we'd learned from the public and offered the value of that initial public research and worked with them to understand how this had been achieved. So how we actually worked with the public in those workshops, what we did and what we were learning. And then we further brought the CSOs into that experience of understanding what outcomes, what artifacts were created from the public and how they might build that into their existing programming. We also spent a good amount of time with the CSOs talking about what peace means, because everybody had a slightly different definition of what peace means within the context of their organization and within the context of themselves. And we took them through all the different public artifacts, all the different public information in order to help them connect to those people that they serve as well. This really, we saw this very clearly, helped the CSOs really build a sense of empathy and build a better understanding of the people that they serve. It actually was really quite strange to see people go from quite a sort of professional business mode to a very personal, engaged mode as they were working with this content from the public. And we allowed them to be more human and be less civil society organization with this work that we did. It also made doing the rapid prototyping with the CSOs a lot smoother, a lot quicker, and they got a lot more out of it. Oh, but just to cover what we did with CSOs, we did defining piece, understanding user journeys and personas, tech tool demos, and impact mapping. So one of the things that I want to make sure that you all know is that being flexible within boundaries is definitely needed. One of the things that we did with the public was we adapted a persona exercise from a written exercise to an interview mode because of feedback that people gave about writing in their second or third language as being, you know, not their preferred way of conducting this activity. And we also found that some participants in the public workshops wanted to lead sections of the outlined work. And so we empowered them and wanted them to be able to do that. So really embodying this sense of working with and co-creating. So into some general sort of tips that are always really good to know if you're doing this kind of work is when you're working with populations that have been influenced by and receiving aid, the participants and populations and people become non-profit language proficient in my experience. And they tend to, in the initial engagements, use certain phrases with researchers, especially if you are very obviously not from that country and very, you know, obviously I'm from white and from the UK, I have a British accent. I can't and wouldn't try and pretend like I was from the community that I was researching with. But I think that this comes from a perspective of wanting to appear fundable in a lot of ways, because the public and the CSOs rely on funding to some extent and support and aid. So yeah, be aware of the aid proficiency language within these spaces that you may do work with. So we're going to move into quite a difficult section of the activity. So you make sure that you have everything that you need to feel comfortable as we talk about working with trauma. So working with trauma and working preemptively with trauma will really help you when you're confronted by these subjects if you're doing work in this space. So we anticipated this quite a lot within the work within Isuku and within Dispatcher. And I want to go into an example of when I was met with this trauma through some of our participants and how we worked through it and how we prepared for it. So one of the public groups that we worked with was Polycom Women. I love them dearly. They do fantastic work. They are a group of women across generations and backgrounds, really dedicated to peace building in a specific area of Nairobi in Kenya called Kibera. Kibera is an informal settlement, or more commonly known as a slum in Nairobi. And it has a lot of political, social, economical, and gender-based issues. So lots of different challenges there when you live there and work there. Working with Polycom and with some of the other attendees in the workshops that we did, both in public and CSOs around peace, was one of the first times I was really confronted with a non-theoretical version of my own relationship with trauma, as well as other people's relationship with trauma and that subject matter and that context within the work that we're doing. So one of the things that, if you remember from the work that we did with the public, we were asking people to do was a journey map exercise of a crisis or an incident. And some of the attendees started to talk about when they were kidnapped, when they were robbed, when they witnessed gender-based violence, tribal violence, political violence, and all manner of things. And the Polycom women spoke in great detail about a number of different things that they've done around peace activity and protest activity that ended in injury of themselves when they had stones thrown at them for being outspoken in public. To just give you a quick idea of what Polycom women do and the kinds of activities that they do in peace building, they will do things like when they know that there is a big election coming up, or when they know that there is some kind of political topic or economic topic that's big in the area, they will go into the public spaces in Kibera and they will play football badly. because but they play football incredibly well now. They're very, very good, but they will purposefully play it badly, because what that does is it distracts the youths, which are often the people that are targeted to spread misinformation, often bribed, often paid to promote violent activity, or maybe even sometimes start crises or start fires sometimes, but they will be distracted by the women playing football badly and come and intervene and then play football with them and teach them how to play football better. And then the women then get an opportunity to talk about what peace means to them and have conversations with these youths. So that's the kind of work that Polycon Women do. I think it's fantastic. So I love to promote what they're doing as and whenever I can. But to talk a little bit more about the activity that we did for the journey map. So here's an example on screen. We separated it into before, during, and after the incident or the crisis. And to zoom in a little bit closer, I don't know about you all on the call right now, but this was one of the first times that I'd been presented with journey map exercises with written information like war and high food prices, and then the sound of bullets, and even some more upsetting and extreme written information that I'm not showing right now. But what I can certainly tell you is that I really did struggle to truly understand these circumstances and how to respond to it as a researcher. But what we did do prior to these activities is we anticipated that we would be raising these traumatic subjects. And so I did my own exercise and encouraged all the researchers and the participants within the project to do a map of their own crisis or own incident experience. So on screen at the moment is my own example that I used within the workshop around the Manchester Arena bombing and my experience being connected with somebody that lost somebody during that incident. So after that intense talk about trauma, a little bit of in-depth information about how when you're confronted with trauma, how best to prepare, is I would encourage you to do some very optional homework, which is to think of a deeply upsetting event in your life and try to begin to journey map this event. It's not about who has the most upsetting event. It's not a competition. Just an event that you find very difficult. And the reason that I recommend that you do this as researchers is so that you can begin to understand your own responses to difficult subject matter that you have a connection to. And also that process of commodification that often we do as researchers, where when we ask people to do things like journey maps and personas, and we turn them into things that we call artifacts or design discovery research. And it does help, I think, ground that kind of exercise and ground that kind of content in the real and the human experience of what it is. Just want to cover other ways that we made sure that we did the work within Izuku's workshops ethically. The attendees were notified pre-workshop of all the subject matter that we were covering. There was psychological support on site. There was confidentiality and consent with their content and their information. The researchers went through the same processes that we asked the participants to do. And researchers really went through compassionate connection exercises and examples within the workshops to actually kind of try and close that distance between researcher, tool creator, and people that were co-creating with us. And the researchers were also supported post-workshop. There is such a thing called moral injury and lots of vicarious trauma that can occur after doing work like this. I'm going to move into another quite tricky topic at the moment, but it's important to cover before I begin to wrap this up. And that is, as a researcher within these contexts, about your reactions and your physical and emotional reactions and what participants tell you and how they react and how you react. This isn't necessarily about being a certain way or trying to act. It's mostly about preparing yourself and understanding better when you're positioned in these contexts as a researcher, just to prepare yourselves for these kinds of difficult conversations. So in the session with this person on screen at the moment, we were talking about dispatcher. We were talking about how we help each other in crisis. And very quickly, we got into a conversation about what is poverty and the differences between UK or Western poverty and Kenyan poverty. So poverty is different in all different contexts and countries, its connections to the class system, and you should be ready as a researcher to understand and listen to those differences. And what I had to do was really battle any biased, ill-informed reactions that I had to some of the things that the participant was honestly telling me about their own experience with poverty in connection to this community cohesion, this community support network. So many subjects that are surprising can arise when you're doing this kind of work. Many different difficult kinds of topics. Because I am white with a UK British accent, there is an inherent historical context around colonialization when I'm doing work in these countries. And I've talked a lot about that to my own support networks and my own colleagues. And I think the best way to approach this is to be completely honest and transparent and know that there is that opportunity to address that topic when it is culturally, historically, and contextually relevant, and that we shouldn't shy away from this if we're doing work in these contexts. I think that when you don't approach it in that way, it can come across as very disrespectful to your participants and the people that you're working with, the communities you're working with. I would recommend that you spend time understanding, reading about the history, the culture, all the different things that you can gather about the place that you are going to do this research, and practice having conversations as best you can with people that feel comfortable doing that with you. You can role play if you feel happy, and you can simulate certain things, but understand that these topics will come up, and they will come up in surprising ways. Leading into that, there's always a recommendation to think about the ways in which you relate to participants internationally. Think about how you differ and how you connect around race and ethnicity, perceived gender or sex or identity, social status, different interests and circumstances in education. And this is especially important when you are doing work outside of your own country of residence. I've found that food is often a good universal value, but also be careful around folks with food-related trauma, because that is something that indeed came up in work that I was doing. So you can't always assume that a subject is a universally relational topic. I don't go into much depth about these two different definitions that I have here. In fact, they're definitions that I've written myself, so I think that there's probably better academic definitions of these things, but these are the methods or ways in which I've approached research that I want to just briefly talk about. I've got an embedded ethnographic, which is honestly my preference. I don't think either of these are like the best way of doing things, or like one is better than the other, but I think that this is kind of how I've operated as a design researcher in these contexts. So there's an embedded ethnographic, and there's a sort of transitory researcher mode. And the person that taught me about embedded ethnographic was a colleague, and this is a photo from when my colleague did work in Kathmandu in Nepal, and they spent a good number of months with the community members there working alongside them and doing ethnographic work, anthropological approaches to the design research around the technology that they were interacting with and building and wanting to use for crisis response. And this was the person that really helped me understand how I wanted to approach ethnographic research as a designer. And here are some examples of how I've done it myself. So I am still actually a volunteer for React UK, which used to be Team Rubicon UK. Some of you might be familiar with Team Rubicon. It's an international crisis response humanitarian volunteer organisation. And also some pictures of me working with SARAID, which is a urban search and rescue organisation here in the UK. I was part of their community resilience team. And these photos are from the operation that we did around the response that we did to COVID in the UK, where I was part of the HQ team coordinating COVID relief efforts. Some flood prevention there as well in the middle, and the CRT community resilience team was when I was helping with the homelessness aid around holiday season. This is kind of what ethnographic embedded research means to me. It means a longer relationship with the people that I learn from and research with. in a nutshell, essentially. And I put this one in recently because I finished my international ops field training last week. I was successful, I passed. I wasn't going to put this in if I didn't pass, but yes, we did earthquake and tsunami simulations for about 4 to 5 days in the countryside with React. So if you get a chance to check out what React do, I highly recommend you check them out, and well done to all my cohort that successfully passed their crisis response international operations training. I hope to see you on an international humanitarian op soon. We also, within Izuku and Dispatcher, we used both methods. So we used ethnographic, and we also used this kind of transitory. And sometimes we just need to get in there and find the information out that we need in the most participatory way that possible. And I don't think this is a bad thing. I'm just kind of noting that there are different approaches that you can have. Like, so you can have this more embedded approach, or you can have this approach, which is arguably a little bit more traditional, familiar maybe to designers, about getting in there, understanding what the problem is, having a very short contextual relationship with somebody that you're working with. But I've actually found that the way that I want to operate as a researcher, as a humanitarian and human rights researcher, it takes a much more embedded ethnographic approach than dip in, dip out. So that's what I lean to. It's interesting, investigate how it feels for you. So I've got some really quick tips now before I wrap up. So these are going to go quick. Take burner phones or extra devices. Do interviews in pairs or threes. Make sure that you're choosing public or safe areas to do your interviews, and check out the areas beforehand. Do this for yourself, but also your participants. Just because your participants are from a community, from a country, doesn't mean that that location will feel safe for them all the time. Make sure that you understand where they feel comfortable and also where you feel comfortable. Also understand there's lots of cultural differences around timekeeping and acceptable amounts of lateness. Make sure you do that research about when you will meet people and how long you will spend with them. Look into local police and hospital structures, simulate and discuss those things if you feel like there might be something that come up. Make sure you have a make sure you have a field study travel and safety policy as well when you investigate that. One thing that I'm very aware of is I always check out the laws around LGBT plus criminalization in countries before I go do things. I have definitely been to countries where I, as my identity, am criminalized, and make sure that I put the appropriate things in place to feel safe. Be aware that some places you go might have dress codes. One of the places we did research was a Catholic university that required a certain amount of coverage on your body and a certain amount of dress code. Be respectful of that. Make sure you understand what might be happening locally around that time, and also generally. So there might be increased crime, there might be increased political unrest. Make sure that you know what's going on. And don't just look at governmental sources, look at individual people-based resources and what humans are saying from those places, as well as the governments. Make sure you get your vaccinations and take ample medication. I've been unwell several times on many a design field research, but you know, it's part of the job in a way. There's some stuff that you can do to practice before you go to do this kind of work. You can do this in the place that you live, only if you feel comfortable. So make sure that do some community research online. I use things like couchsurfing, pen pal websites. I explore other communities and cultures. When I'm around, I take photos of interesting cultural things, posters in cafes, graffiti, notice boards. I try and absorb as much information with consent as possible. And one really great thing that I learned to be more comfortable with was asking taxi drivers and people that do transit lots of questions. You can often get huge amounts of information about the current sort of state of the communities, although, you know, maintain a sort of understanding and objectivity about what people tell you. It could be biased, but talk to taxi drivers, talk to the people that are from there, from the community, and ask them questions about your chosen research topic, and see whether you can start that research in that ethnographic embedded way a little bit earlier. But also be careful when you're in a taxi, you're in a stranger's vehicle. There's a power imbalance there, and I've definitely had some uncomfortable conversations about political differences when I've probed into these topics. So just, again, be prepared. So to wrap things up, there's a number of different things I'm going to recommend that you can do. One is reports and guides from NGOs. There's a number of which on screen. You can access these via the slides afterwards. NGOs and organizations put out amazing reports. There's one on the Kerala floods here on screen. There's a great one from an organization called Safe Sisters around digital security for women and human rights defenders. And there's the Human Rights Big Data and Technology Project on screen. There are human rights and technology events and conferences. These are some of them: RightsCon, the International Freedom Festival, MozFest, Peace Technology Labs, and Tech for Good. And I would hope to see you there, but we have a human rights-centered design community. It's an initiative that brings together people across human rights and technology to talk about these important topics, like how do we deal with trauma and traumatic subject when in the tools that we design. Lots of organizations to check out: EFF, Access Now, Advocacy Assembly. I really recommend usable.tools, amazing tools that are focused around security and privacy for technology. Great stuff there for designers. Design Justice Network and the Code for America Qualitative Research Guide is fantastic as well. And it wouldn't be a talk by me if I didn't recommend a number of books as well. On screen at the moment, we've got Designing When Everyone Designs by Ezio Manzini. We've got Digital Economies at Global Margins by Mark Graham. We've got Digital Witness, which is by Deborah Lee Koenig and Murray. We've got Digital Democracy and Analog Politics, which is a beautiful book, amazing book by Nanjala Nyabola. And Civic Technologist Practice Guide by Sid Harrell. There are many more books that I can recommend, but I'd start with these for now. And with that, I think we're at time. We're maybe a little bit over time, but thank you so much for listening. You can find me online at these various links. Eriol does design most places, and you can check out my PhD research on my university's website, which is openlab.ncl.ac.uk.
Thank you so much for all of that, Eriol. Thanks so much for sharing those resources too. Again, these slides are available at the link I put in the chat, and we'll share this out again later after the talks. We are a little bit close to the end of time, but there are a bunch of really good questions. So we'll try and answer some of those, and we can share these with Eriol and get answers at a later time too. So I think the first one that I'll bring up is, how has COVID impacted your ability to work with the public in these contexts? It seems really difficult to be able to interface with people in a different country and maybe without the same tools we have.
Absolutely. There is a person, I can drop the links in the chat after when I find them. But there's a person called Fender who wrote some amazing articles about how he is doing his design research across hard to reach communities in Kenya. And he has some great sort of case studies and how he's done it and how he's done it safely, especially across different cultures and different countries have had different access to vaccinations, as we all know, different access to information, different kinds of levels of corruption. And he has done amazing work in his country of origin, Kenya, working within a country that has had hard access to vaccination. So I'd really recommend reading through his articles. But yeah, it's definitely been difficult. So it can still be done. I think I referred to a book which is doing remote research, which is a Rosenfeld book, which is generally about remote research. But I think the most interesting thing around this subject, which is doing research with hard to reach communities for these kinds of tools, actually has always been present. The most hard to reach communities are always going to be the ones, or typically the ones with the most difficult access to communication methods, the kind of most privacy and security concerns. And really, it's always been hard to try and find safe access to doing research with them. I think that some of the things that you can look into if you're curious and want to know how to do that better is using kind of SMS as a way of engaging with people. It doesn't have to be in person. You can find ways of researching with people that allows for the access that they have to certain technologies. But it is going to be technologically based. I'm not going to lie, there are a huge amounts of people that have not been able to be worked with or researched with within the global pandemic. Security and privacy, definitely look into things like PGP encryption for emails, and how different human rights activists that are very focused on security and privacy and identity protection, look out for the kinds of tools and the kinds of processes that they use if you are authentically engaging with them as a design researcher.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, we'll share those resources out. We have another question about working with people who have a different native language, and how to do maybe an accessibility issue. So how do you make sure you're not presenting the language of the researcher as hierarchically above the participant's language? Fixers and interpreters are something that does need to be relied on within this, but I do recognize and do not have a solution for the systemic problem that is design as a practice being a colonial one. I think that some of the best work that can be done is around hiring and paying and working with people that speak the language, are design trained alongside you. I know a lot of you will agree with this, but they do exist. They are not hard to find. There are lots of people doing amazing design work across all countries that you can partner with and pay to help you to do the research with you. Back to inclusive teams.
Absolutely, 100%. I think an organization that is doing this incredibly well at the moment, as well as Ushahidi. Ushahidi does this well, and one organization is called Hover. I can again drop the link. They are a financial app service, USSD, something that might be familiar to some people, but the way in which they approached building their design team, which was one of my former colleagues from Ushahidi, Justin Shearer, leads the design team there. The way that he has approached building that team is has these concerns in mind, like the people that will understand how finance works in West Africa, Nigeria, Cameroon are the designers that work and operate within those countries themselves. So hire them. Hire them.
Yeah, I mean, obvious answer. I mean, we have some more about even how do you prevent having the same traits as historically colonialized oppressors when you're dealing with these marginalized communities. And I guess the same answer applies. It's hire people who can kind of play interference there and represent their own culture in your work. We're almost out of time, but we have 3 more minutes. So I will ask another question that I think is pretty important. So how do you deal with or protect yourself from the emotional overload that can come from research like this? Do you have any tips for that?
Yeah, that's a good one and a hard one. The Human Rights Centered Design Group, honestly, I think I would have had a much harder time if I hadn't found a community of people interested in this topic and willing to talk about not only the stuff that is mostly easy to talk about, but also the stuff that is very, very difficult to talk about. Not to suggest that a community of practitioners doing work in the same or similar areas are a substitute for a good support network and whatever you might have access to for a support network. But honestly, yeah, it's really tough. There is a lot of different phenomenons in this kind of work where, for example, you feel like any time that you're not working on these humanitarian crisis problems, as a designer, as a volunteer, you feel like that's another harm that's come to a person. I definitely have and will continue to have that struggle. There will even be times where you will be faced with somebody that you cannot help. And one of the things that they teach you in doing field work in a humanitarian crisis is a very hard lesson to learn, but you will not be able to help everyone. you will not. And that doesn't mean that you are not a good person. It doesn't mean that you haven't tried really hard. It doesn't mean that you can try again differently next time. But to think that you can will hurt yourself. You'll hurt yourself more than coming to terms with that. Your own sphere of ability and influence. But yeah, it's so community for sharing, support networks, and yeah, knowing the weight of what you do within
your limits, I'm sure.
Yeah, knowing your limits and having that perspective.
Yeah, you can't do anything if you're burnt out, and you got to remember that you can't fix every problem. So that's great. Yeah, thank you so much, Eriol. We're about at time before the next session starts, but I think we can find you on Twitter, like Eriol Does Design, so we can send you some of these more questions, and if anyone wants to reach out to them there, that's the place to do it. So thank you so much, Eriol.
Thank you. Bye, folks.